In the wake of Monday's tragic events in Boston, there is still very little known about the responsible party or the motive. There was, however, immediate debate over semantics, to call it terrorism or not to call it terrorism. Here's how the president addressed the country just hours after the two explosions went off at the Boston Marathon.
Good afternoon, everybody. Earlier today, I was briefed by my Homeland Security team on the events in Boston. We're continuing to monitor and respond to the situation as it unfolds, and I've directed the full resources of the federal government to help state and local authorities protect our people, increase security around the United States as necessary, and investigate what happened. The American people will say a prayer for Boston tonight, and Michelle and I send our deepest thoughts and prayers to the families of the victims in the wake of this senseless loss. We still do not know who did this or why, and people shouldn't jump to conclusions before we have all the facts. But make no mistake, we will get to the bottom of this, and we will find out who did this. We'll find out why they did this. Any responsible individuals, any responsible groups will feel the full weight of justice.
Immediately, discussion of why the president didn't use the word terrorism began, with opinions being handed out left and right as to how to label this attack.
About the president's not using the word terror in this first statement.
Well, look, you can attribute that to all kinds of reasons. I think he's being careful. If this is a terror attack, as it looks so much like it is, we will know soon enough. There's no reason to rush a characterization of that, in my opinion. I wouldn't find fault with him for not saying that.
I didn't hear the word terrorism, but one man's entitled to his opinion, and when you cut down innocent people at a public event, in my mind, it's an act of terrorism, whether it's a homegrown terrorist tied with a jihadist organization or somebody else who knows. It's an act of terrorism.
I hesitate to call what the event was, but whatever it was a terrible tragedy. And no matter how you measure it, I don't know if it's official terrorism or unofficial or whatever, but clearly anyone to act in such a manner is clearly an evil person and deserves to be called as such.
Whether it was a domestic terrorist, a foreign terrorist, a terrorist act this day.
It's cowardly for the perpetrator or perpetrators to have facilitated this type of terrorism.
Shortly after that press briefing, a White House official responded with a statement to clarify that they do believe in the T word being applied there, saying any event with multiple explosive devices, as this appears to be, is clearly an act of terror and will be approached as an act of terror. So how do we define an act of terrorism, and how has it changed since 9/11? Joining us to discuss, we've got HuffPost political economy reporter Zach Carter from Washington, D.C., Michael Hastings, reporter at BuzzFeed and Rolling Stone, and Max Abrahms, poli-sci postdoc at Johns Hopkins University, has written extensively on terrorism. So, gentlemen, thank you all so much for joining me. Thank you for being here, but let me actually pause you for one moment, because we do have Senator Richard Blumenthal joining us on the phone right now to quickly go back to what happened with the expansion of background checks failing in the Senate today. Senator, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you. Great to be with you.
So what is your initial reaction to finding out that it fell just a few votes short of the 60 that were needed today?
I am shocked and saddened, angry, but I am determined that we will come back. And the families are absolutely determined that we're not done. As one of them said to me, we're not even close to done. So I think we're going to see more of this bill, and the cause is not going away, nor is the Connecticut effect going away.
Now, some people that were there viewing the vote today actually were protesting and even said that this is shameful. Do you think that this is a shameful day for the U.S. Senate?
It's a sad day, and in some ways shameful that the United States Senate could vote by 54 in the majority, and the American people can support a measure by 90% and still have it fail. That is a sad day for democracy. But we will move on. As one of the members of the Newtown community said to me after bicycling down from Newtown to Washington, D.C. as part of the so-called Team 26, we need to keep on pedaling. And that's what we're going to continue to do.
And so, you know, if 90% of the American people, as you mentioned, do support at least the expansion of these background checks when it comes to online sales and sales at gun shows. Who are these senators serving? Whose interests are they serving when they vote against such a measure?
The special interests, the gun lobby, the NRA have really had a stranglehold on this issue for maybe a generation. And so they've managed to mobilize a small, vehement, vocal minority. And maybe it's apprehension, or maybe it's other motives or factors. But one way or the other, I think that a vote against background checks is very severely misguided. And the majority of NRA members and of responsible gun owners favor background checks to keep guns out of the hands of criminals, seriously mentally ill, domestic abusers. Makes good sense to anyone who cares about public safety like law enforcement does.
So, Senator, as you said, you are not done. The president said the same thing today when he was speaking from the Rose Garden, that this fight is not over. So what is the next step? What is the plan B?
Well, there are various plans. One is that it will come back on the calendar and be brought back for votes, because there probably will be no final vote on the bill, so we can vote on other amendments down the line, which maybe will seek more common ground.
All right, Senator Blumenthal, I want to thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you. All right, back to our political junkies. Gentlemen, hello. Thank you for waiting on the line. Now, before we jump into terrorism, any comments? Zach, we heard from you when it comes to, what happened today in the Senate. Michael or Max, any thoughts on background checks and the expansion of them failing today by just a few votes? No.
I'm going to hold off. I'm going to hold off for the terrorism, which is what I study.
Yeah, they should get off people's guns, man. Let them have their guns. What happens if a bomb goes off next to you at a marathon? You need a fucking gun.
All right. It's just background checks for guns that are sold online and at gun shows. No one's taking away your guns, but way to perpetuate that myth. Moving on to what we said before, which is the debate and the discussion over whether or not to use the word terrorism, whether that's something that can be applied. I mean, as I said, there's still very little known about who is responsible for what happened in Boston on Monday, what the motive might be. But, just overall, let me bring up a piece by Spencer Ackerman that he wrote at Wired's Danger Room when he was talking about when and why to call a bombing terrorism. And so, one of the quotes that we have from him there are that terrorism is not just violence aimed at civilians. Terrorism is violence aimed at civilians with a political objective, most often designed to cause a spectacle. Max, what do you say? What is the definition of terrorism in your eyes? Does it have to be something where there is a political motive behind it that we're aware of, or is it just to try to inflict mass casualties that are random and scare people, terrorize them?
I mean, there tend to be three components to the definition, at least as it's applied in North America. It's different in the Middle East. But the way that we do it in North America, it tends to be a non-state actor. So that means either a lone wolf or, using violence against civilian targets for some kind of a political objective. And that political objective, it's sort of a broad understanding of a political objective. It need not be sort of a concrete, tangible political concession. It could be, an Islamist view, or, wanting a communist society or utopian life. So it's a broad conception of the political aim. In this case, I feel rather comfortable calling it terrorism. Based on what we know, it seems like we have a non-state actor. The marathon, you don't get a softer target than that, obviously a civilian target. The third component we don't know because we don't have the perpetrators in custody, so we don't know what their aims are, but I assume that they were broadly political in nature.
Michael, what would you say?
Yeah, I agree. I think that sounds correct to me.
Do you think that people, though, that there's been a change in the way that we actually approach terrorism and using that term post 9/11? Have people become a little bit more cautious about using it?
I think the question is, do they want to, just because it's terrorism doesn't mean you have to go to war. And I think as long as we can understand that, we can deal with the concept kind of reasonably and say, look who did it. It's a tactic. Terrorism is a tactic. And this seems to fit what that would look like. And obviously the significance of the city, how they did it, it was made for TV, the whole deal. So yeah, I think of course this is terrorism. And whether or not the White House, when it wants to define it as that at this point, I think it's fairly irrelevant. I think you just have to wait and see how it plays out.
At this point, they have called it an act of terror. But, Zach, let me bring you in on this. For example, Glenn Greenwald had a piece over at The Guardian where he now writes, where he was saying that in U.S. political discourse these days, terrorism has no real meaning other than violence perpetrated by Muslims against the West. That really, there are questions of what is domestic terrorism? Is it different than international terrorism? And are we more cautious to use it now because of, certain segments of the population that we have seen be targeted so specifically in the last decade or so?
Yeah, I think to the extent that this word has meaning within American political discourse, it really is about whether or not brown people are doing the violence or not. I'm perfectly comfortable in outside of a September 11th. You even saw this a little bit during the during the 2012 campaign, where there was that weird moment during the debates where people were really ganging up on, or Mitt Romney was trying to go after President Obama for whether or not he'd labeled the Benghazi attacks a terrorist attack or not. In practical reality, a lot of this stuff, it doesn't really matter whether it's terrorism or not. If a lot of people are dying and it's really bad, something can just be awful and violent without being an act of terror. And when you think about the things that are terrible about terrorist acts, I think I agree with this definition here, where we generally distinguish between state actors and non-state actors. Something is an act of war and something else is an act of terror. But is it really, that much better for a state actor to be killing lots of civilians for a political aim? I think to a great extent, the meaning of this word is really just tied up in whether or not Americans think brown people are responsible for it. So the way the word is being used now in political discourse, I think the president is trying to give himself some sort of political escape hatch in case there's a brown person who's responsible for this. So he said, well, yeah, I did let very, very early, and then shield himself from a lot of what will most likely be very racist attacks from his right.
And we have already seen a lot of, racist attacks, whether it be from just random people voicing their opinions on Twitter to, of course, there are some members of Congress that always have a word to say in this too. We saw Representative Louis Gohmert say that perhaps these are people that, this has something to do with immigration reform, and these are people posing as Mexicans coming across the border that are really Al-Qaeda militants.
Louis Gohmert is one of the classic crazies in Congress, but people that the Beltway really respect, the centrists, like Susan Collins has already said, it's not hard to imagine this is an act of Islamic extremism. Well, it's not hard to imagine it's an act of Islamic extremism. It's not hard to imagine it's a lot of different things. But it's interesting that she felt the need to say that. Maybe it is. Who knows? We don't really know, but it seems like most of there's only you can only take political flack. You can only take political flack for failing to be tough on Islamic extremism in the United States in American politics. If you're not tough enough on other types of totally insane violence, you don't necessarily take the same kind of political hit.
Well, the thing is, go ahead, Max. Yeah.
Usually when I say this conventional definition of terrorism, somebody will object, and they will say, well, why is your definition restricted to non-state actors? Is it not true that states are also responsible for horrible atrocities? And the answer is, of course, states are, and indeed, if you look at the number of civilian deaths caused by violence in the international system, the vast majority of them are not actually caused by non-state actors. They're actually caused by states, like the Assad regime, like the Holocaust. Large genocidal campaigns fall at the hands of governments, not non-state actors, and yet the definition that we tend to use is restricted to non-state actors, and I'm happy with that for analytical purposes. But the point is that we have a rich vocabulary to choose from in the United States. There are horrible things in the world that need not fall under the definition of terrorism. So to say that state actors are not terrorists, there's something else. That's not to give them a free ride. We should think of another term that has the same, poignancy maybe, to describe state actors that engage in this kind of civilian targeting.
And I think I would agree with that from a purely linguistic perspective. But if you're going to talk about, the moral thrust of the word terrorism and the fact that it's clearly being deployed in a moral and political sense right now, I do think you have to point out that there are a lot of different ways to be violent and terrible, and that being a non-state actor and killing lots of people, being a brown person and killing lots of people, is not necessarily worse or better than being all kinds of other people who kill lots of people for crazy reasons.
Right.
Well, let me just bring in a new Rasmussen poll that was just put out today. 51% of respondents there said that they support imprisoning terrorist suspects despite a lack of hard evidence to convict them. Which to me just makes us ask if we have learned anything when it comes to the overreaction, right? If we just go back to this implicit fear that a terrorist attacks really puts into everybody, have we learned nothing from the last 10 years, from what happened post 9/11, from the loss of civil liberties? I mean, it's gotten to the point where you'd like to think that it's not always going to be politicized, but here's a piece from David Sirota where he said, let's hope the Boston Marathon bomber is a white American. And he's talking about how there's a double standard because white terrorists are dealt with as lone wolves, Islamists are existential threats, where we have to then start changing the entire way that we travel, changing the entire way that we live our lives, where if it's a lone wolf, no one's going to make you take any extra security measures anywhere you go.
I think the idea here that we have to imprison terrorism suspects while they are suspects, it may seem totally plausible to a lot of people, but if we're going to do that, we should also talk about the other types of violent plagues that we have in society. For instance, we have a huge plague of sexual violence in this country. There's an enormous amount of sexual assault and rape that occurs, and almost nobody goes to jail for it. And if we start saying anybody who's a suspect in a crime needs to go to prison, only for heinous violent crimes, for instance, if we're going to make a special exception for terrorism, then why not do it for rapist suspects, for sexual assault suspects?
Can I pick that question up just from a different perspective? I think that if you look at just the pure number of people who have been killed, so far there are 3 fatalities, and you look at the amount of, say, media attention, then clearly it's disproportionate, in comparison to other maladies that afflict Americans in numerical terms. So in that sense, perhaps, we haven't learned anything. We're still overreacting. But remember that, after 9/11, in response to that attack, we invaded a country that had absolutely nothing to do with it. And I think that the selling of the Iraq War, the Iraq War just never would have happened without 9/11. And I think that Americans today are much savvier. We want to know, what is the nature of the perpetrator? What is their, are there more attacks? Or is this just a one-off thing? And so I think that we've become a little bit smarter, a little bit more vicious about linking things that don't actually have an inherent link. And my prediction is that regardless of who the perpetrator is, it will not fundamentally alter our policy in any way. And so with that said,
Max, I'm sorry, your audio is starting to cut out, and so it's becoming hard to hear you, so let me just cut you off there for a moment. I think that we got the gist of what it is that you're saying. Michael, do you care to weigh in on this?
What aspect in particular?
The entire conversation, I guess, that we've been having. I mean, let me play a clip real quick.
Play a clip.
Okay, hold on. Let's go back to September of 2001, and then it was President George W. Bush who launched a war on terror. Listen to this clip.
Our war on terror begins with Al-Qaeda, but it does not end there. It will not end until every terrorist group of global reach has been found, stopped, and defeated.
Every terrorist group, global reach.
That's like comparing a horrible traffic accident to like stumbling in the sidewalk and banging your knee. I mean, this is banging your knee. September 11th is completely different. I think the only thing you can say is that the restraint, we are showing some sort of restraint here, and that, yeah, we're not going out and saying, oh, we're going to go hunt them down and kill them everywhere. I mean, I think we're being fairly reasonable, and I think the media actually, despite obviously getting a lot of initial reports wrong, and which is common in breaking news, has showed somewhat restraint, at least from what I've been seeing in terms of not being quick to fuel the fire and to qualify everything they're saying as, you know, we don't really know what this is. And I think that's what happens when terrorism becomes a fabric of your society, when it becomes something that's more a normal state. You then don't respond and overreact as we did in September 11th.
So I guess my question there, and I was going back to that clip, just to say, is that something that we could push blame on for the last decade or so? But then since then, have we learned our lesson? Is there a lot more caution that's applied, and and rightly so?
There's some. I think some. There's. Obama's much more cautious about these things. You know, President Obama is. I think Americans as a whole. I think even if you had a foreign link to this, I think it would be a tough sell to do some sort of land invasion or something crazy like that. Yeah. So we have enough restraint on it as well. But that's not to say we wouldn't bomb Pakistan or bomb the Northwest Frontier Province or do something like that, which we're doing anyway.
Can I just say, part of the change is technological. So, the military has available to it these drones in a way that we didn't have back then. So, to be fair, things have changed. We don't, even if it were the Bush administration, they wouldn't necessarily have to put boots on the ground. In today's day and age, we could just, take out militant leaders from the sky.
Let me just, bring up one more poll too, and Zach, let me go to you. I mean, if you think that we are finally starting to learn some lessons. This one said that, a Boston bombing poll found sadness and horror, understandably so, obviously so, I guess you could say, as the first concerns of people, and no rush to actually put blame on it. I believe 26% said that their first thoughts were of terrorism, terrorists, or terror generally, but only 5% responded with the word implying an attempt to assign blame or responsibility, such as Muslim or Al-Qaeda. And so, earlier we brought up the Louis Gohmerts of the bunches, which are tend to be a little more crazy, or some of the more established political talking heads. But as a society, do you think that we're moving past it?
It's tough to say because I am embedded inside the Beltway, which is its own sort of chamber of insanity. Here, it does seem like there is like a pretty significant chorus of scolds who are shaming people, who are saying that this is an act of Islamic extremism without any evidence. Publicly, I do think the Iraq War's scars are pretty deep in the American psyche. I think even people who supported the war, who even go around saying they still supported the war, or still support the war, 10 years later, don't really mean that when they say that. In many cases, I think oftentimes they just feel like they can't admit that this was a terrible thing that they supported. And so I think people are a little bit more cautious about who to place blame for, and also the scope of this incident is much less severe than something like September 11th, as Michael mentioned earlier. It's a lot harder to turn this into a significant political act when there's nobody coming forward and saying that this is a political attack, and so it's harder to wonder why are they targeting us if it seems more like a random act of violence in people's mind. So maybe in that sense we haven't learned that much, but I do think there's at least a little more caution in the American public today than there was 12 years ago.
All right, gentlemen, I have to wrap it up there, but thank you all so much for joining. And like I said again, I mean, there's still so little that we know about the situation here at this point in time, but it's just, you immediately see the rush as to how to label things. And of course, the the hope there is that it's something that won't be made bigger than it should be at the end of the day. So thanks so much for joining us.
Good to see you, Honor.
Thank you.
Our guys, stick around. We have more top stories coming up in a moment.